Welcome to Excel magic trick number 1454. Hey, if you want to download this Excel workbook file, either the start file or finish file so you can follow along, click on the link below the video. Hey, in this video, we want to see how to create a DAX measure to count customer totals between an upper and lower limit for each month. Now, in our last video, 1453, we saw how to do this with an array formula. Here was the array formula. We created this cross tabulated table with counts for customer total sales for a given month and a given sales category. Now, the problem with the array formula was once we got above 10,000 rows of data, this formula calculated slowly. And this is a very complicated formula to create. Well, Microsoft invented the DAX formula language for Excel Power Pivot or Power BI Desktop to solve this exact problem. We can make calculations on big data and have our formulas calculate quickly. Now, we have the same tables as our last video. This table has customers, 81 different customers. Here we have our sales table, about 3,500 rows. Here we have our sales category table, a lower and upper limit for each sales category. Also, because we're going to be using the data model and DAX, we need a date table. This has the date, month number, and month. Now, I've already started the pivot table over here. Months are on the row, and our sales categories are on the columns. If we go over and look at our data model, Power Pivot, data model button, there's our F sales table. We've already calculated one measure for total sales. There's a one-to-many relationship for the date table and the D customer. And there's our disconnected sales table with a lower, upper, and our category. Now, we could go over to data view, and there's our first measure that was already created. We could create our measures over here in the measure grid, but I think we're going to go over to Excel. Once we click in a single cell, we can come over to our field list, and whichever table we want our measure to appear in, we can right-click the table and say Add Measure. And we can create our measure in this Measure dialog box. Now, the name of this measure is going to be Count Customer Sales by Sales Category and Month. Now, what we would really like to do since we're counting customers is we'd like to use the COUNTROWS function and count how many customers are in this table, given our conditions for counting. Well, we can actually do that. We can use the COUNTROWS, and then we'll filter the customer table using the filter function. So you ready? Our first outer function will be COUNTROWS. COUNTROWS is going to need some table. We'd like to just put D customer table, but that's not going to work. We need to filter that. So we'll wrap the filter function around D customer. And filter is an iterator. When we put D customer into the table argument and type a comma, our filter expression, this will actually filter this table by looking at each row, all 81 customers in the D customer table. That means it'll iterate over every row and determine whether it should be included in the filter or not. Now, we're interested in total sales, so I'm going to use a square bracket and T. I see my measure there, total sales. Now, right now, that total sales is a measure. This whole formula will actually sit in each cell in our pivot table. The criteria for the month, which is from the date table, will flow across the relationship to the sales table. And if we're talking about February, the F sales table will be filtered down to just the sales for February. That criteria flows in and calculates, for example, February total sales. But because this is a measure, context transition will happen, which just means that the criteria, meaning each individual row throughout the iteration, that customer will flow in and be an additional criteria for total sales. Now, the reason that the measure does that is because when you use a measure, there's an invisible calculate function around every measure. What it does is something called context transition. That means it will transition the row context, the individual customer criteria, into filter context so that total sales can be calculated for the correct month and the correct customer. Now, we got that. Now we need to ask the question of the customer's total sale. Are you greater than? And we need the lower limit, and then we need to say, are you less than or equal to the upper limit? Now, how are we going to get the lower and upper limit from the disconnected table? Well, guess what? We have it sitting as a column header criteria in our pivot table. So I'm going to use the min function and say, please give me the min of disconnected. And I'm going to down arrow to the lower limit and then close parentheses. Now, that's just the condition for filtering for the lower end. We need to include the upper end. And that means we're doing an AND logical test. Now, I could use the AND function here, or I could use the operator ampersand ampersand to tell filter expression to do an AND logical test. And now I need to square bracket T to get total sales. And now we need to ask for the upper limit, are you less than or equal to? And I'm going to use the max function and then DIS and get the upper limit. Now, what did we do here? We have two total sales. Each sales for each customer for each month is going to be compared to the lower and upper limit. Filter, if I close this off, filter will take those conditions and filter the customer table. And then, of course, count rows. We'll count the rows in that filtered table. Close parentheses, and that formula will work. Now, in just a moment after we drop this into this pivot table, we'll look at a visualization that will help us understand how this formula is working. I'm going to click OK. There is our count customer sales. When I drag it down here, look at that. And notice, if you watch the last video, when we copied the formula over and down, it took a long time to calculate. But that DAX measure calculated instantly. And there are all of our counts for each sales category and each given month. Now, I don't want the grand totals here, and I don't have any other criteria to drop here. So I'm just going to come up to Design, Grand Totals, and Off for Rows and Columns. And there's our report for each one of the months and sales category. Now, I want to go take a look over here on the sheet picture. I want to take a look at how this is calculating. Now, I meant to hide these, so I'm going to hide these. Here's our formula. Count rows filter. There's the customer table, and there's our two conditions. Now, when filter sees D customer, there's the entire table of all customers. And it will iterate over every single row. Now, when it gets to total sales, the month criteria will flow in to help it calculate, and then context transition will bring the customer criteria in. So I want to take a look at internally what's happening. This is what it looks like inside the formula. These total sales, as it iterates over D customer, calculates the correct monthly total for each one of the customers. Now, I selected, if we go look at the pivot table, I selected this cell right here. So this is January. So internally, it generates all of these. And then it needs to, for each one of the total sales, see if it's greater than the min and less than or equal to the max. So the next calculation the formula would make is something like this. Is 0 between these? No. Is 1,105 between these two? No. But 454.66 is between this upper and lower amount. Then what does filter do? Filter takes that whole table of 81 rows and just takes where it gets a true. Then count rows, counts how many rows there are. And sure enough, for January in the first sales category, there are 37. And if we go look at our pivot table, that's 37. When the formula copies over in the pivot table, it's still looking at January, but now it sees the next sales category. So if I were to come over here, we're showing everything, but now we're going to change the lower and upper. And filter will filter just to see the trues, and then count rows will count to get that 7. We look over here. That is the correct customer sales count for this month and sales category. All right, that was a little fun with our DAX formula. And remember, if you like this video, click that thumbs up, leave a comment, and sub, because there's always more videos to come. And we will see you next video.